What happens when the youngest White House press secretary walks into a prestigious lecture hall and confronts a world-famous scholar who just called Jesus Christ a myth? This isn't a sermon, it's not a debate. It's a collision between faith and arrogance, history and ideology, silence and courage. And it all unfolds in front of hundreds of STUNS students, and millions more online. The hallways of the Eastbridge Institute for Civic Thought buzzed with low conversations and the occasional shuffle of dress shoes on polished marble. It was day 2 of the annual Public Culture and Policy Symposium, and the Kennedy Lecture Hall was nearing capacity. Karoline Leavitt had arrived quietly through a side entrance, scheduled to appear later in the afternoon on a panel about Gen Z's influence on governance and digital communication. Dressed in a sharp slate gray suit with her press badge clipped to her lapel, she moved with the practiced composure of someone used to navigating tense rooms in D.C. She wasn't there to make a scene, only to represent, speak, and leave. But then she heard it. As she passed the lecture hall's glass-paneled doors, the words struck her, not just controversial, but personal. "The story of Jesus is no more real than Norse mythology," a voice declared with calm conviction. "We must stop pretending religion has a place in shaping serious policy. It belongs to the past, not the future." Karoline paused. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Dr. Malcolm Wren, the secular icon of Eastbridge, a scholar revered in elite circles for his fierce advocacy of reason over belief. His voice carried with measured disdain, landing like carefully placed daggers. Jesus is a socio-cultural fabrication, used to control the masses, perpetuate guilt, and stunt intellectual progress. Let's not romanticize it. Let's call it what it is: fiction. She stood still, one hand gently curled into a fist beside her hip. It wasn't the first time she'd heard Christianity dismissed by academics, but this was different. This wasn't private cynicism, it was public erasure. And she wasn't just any listener, she was a Catholic, a mother, and the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. Someone who had walked into briefing rooms filled with ridicule and fire, yet never wavered on her value. She knew the risks. Challenging a scholar in his own house wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. The audience in that hall wasn't looking for faith. They'd come for facts, arguments, and spectacle. And Dr. Wren gave them all three with flair. Still, she took one steady breath and turned toward the door. It wasn't planned, it wasn't political, but it was necessary. Karoline wasn't about to let silence answer that kind of certainty. Not today. Not when truth, faith-based or not, was being treated like fantasy. She opened the door, stepped into the auditorium, and walked straight into the fire. On stage at the Kennedy Lecture Hall under a halo of soft white lighting and the steady gaze of nearly 400 attendees, Dr. Malcolm Wren stood like a man in total command. Tall, lean, and immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he gripped the podium with relaxed authority, his voice sliding through the room with practiced clarity. A revered secular thinker and best-selling author of The Myth Engine, How Religion Hijacked Reason, Wren had built a career out of dismantling what he called the romantic fog of faith, and today he was in his element. "The story of Jesus Christ," he began, "is no more grounded in historical certainty than the tales of Thor or Zeus. It is, in essence, mythology with better marketing." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience. He continued, his cadence slow and deliberate, slicing each syllable like a scalpel. "You may admire the morals. You may even be moved by the poetry, but let's not confuse sentiment with substance." He gestured toward a massive screen behind him, now displaying ancient texts and comparative mythologies. Walk on water, water into wine, resurrection from the dead. These are not journalistic records, they are motifs, narrative tools designed to shape belief, not document truth. He pivoted slightly, hands now moving as he warmed to his argument. The modern world must reckon with a difficult reality. Religious thinking, particularly Christian ideology, has infiltrated our politics, our courts, and our classrooms. And while tradition tells us this is virtuous, evidence tells us otherwise. From policy delays around climate change to assaults on reproductive rights, the fingerprints of theological interference are everywhere. Laws rose now. louder, more confident. He welcomed it with a slight bow of his head. Then came the blow that reverberated past academic boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, Rin said, locking eyes with the crowd, we must reject the infantilizing claim that belief in Jesus Christ is a prerequisite for morality or meaning. It is not. It never was. And to cling to it today is not just irrational, it is irresponsible. The room held its breath for a moment, then applause again, this time more forceful. Ren offered a satisfied nod. He had delivered this speech or versions of it at universities across the country, but here at Eastbridge, his intellectual home turf, the reception was always a symphony. He turned to Anya Morales, the event's moderator seated nearby, and offered her a small smile. She nodded back, poised to transition into the panel discussion. But before she could rise, the rear auditorium doors clicked open with a subtle finality. All heads turned. Karoline Leavitt, sharp and composed, walked down the center aisle with deliberate steps. No announcement, no fanfare, just presence. The audience buzzed. Phones rose. A few gasps fluttered from the front row. Dr. Ren's brow furrowed slightly, just enough to betray that this was not on the program. He adjusted his lapel, maintaining poise. It appears, he said, voice smooth but wary, that we have an unscheduled rebuttal. Karoline stopped halfway down the aisle, her voice calm but carrying effortlessly through the silence. No rebuttal, Dr. Ren, just a necessary correction. And with that the temperature in the room shifted. The lecture had ended. The debate had just begun. A hush settled over the Kennedy Lecture Hall as Karoline Leavitt ascended the steps to the stage, her heels clicking with steady rhythm against the polished wood. Though she hadn't been invited to this session, no one dared stop her. Her reputation preceded her. The youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, a rising Gen Z figure with sharp instincts and sharper conviction. But this moment wasn't about politics. Her expression said it all. This was personal. As she reached the edge of the stage, she turned to face Dr. Ren and the hundreds of eyes now glued to the scene unfolding before them. I didn't plan to speak during your lecture, she began, her voice clear, calm, and unwavering. But I just heard you declare that Jesus Christ is a fabrication, a fairy tale no more real than Norse gods. And, while you're entitled to your beliefs, you presented that as historical certainty, not opinion. That's not just incorrect, it's misleading. Dr. Rin tilted his head, the faintest smirk playing at his lips. Ah, he said, voice laced with amusement. Ms. Leavitt, the podium is all yours. By all means, enlighten us with your faith-based facts. There was a murmur in the audience. Some chuckled nervously. Others leaned forward, sensing the shift. But Karoline didn't flinch. You want facts? She asked, stepping fully into the spotlight. Tacitus, a Roman historian who wasn't a Christian, wrote about the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, referenced Jesus as a real man with a following. These aren't scriptures, they're external sources, cited by scholars across ideological lines. You don't have to believe Jesus was the Son of God, but to declare him a complete fiction? That's not reason. That's arrogance. The murmurs deepened. A few students took out their phones, now recording. Dr. Ren crossed his arms. Fragments, he said coolly. Written decades after the supposed events, anecdotes recycled through oral tradition, hardly credible. Karoline took a single step closer. Even if they were written decades later, they're consistent with what we know of that time. Names, places, political tensions. That's how historical verification works, Dr. Ren. You don't get to throw out everything inconvenient just because it challenges your worldview. The silence was thick now, not stunned but bristling with anticipation. Ren's smile faded slightly, replaced by the calculated expression of a man realizing this wasn't going to be the easy takedown he expected. I'm not here to preach, Karoline said, addressing the room. But I won't stand by while you dismiss not just my faith, but the historical reality of a figure whose life has shaped civilizations. You may not believe in his divinity, but to deny his existence entirely? That's not critical thinking. That's ideological theater. The audience sat frozen, breath held. For the first time in the lecture, Dr. Wren didn't reply immediately. Karoline turned toward the students, her presence grounded, commanding. "Let's have a real conversation," she said. "One that respects reason, but doesn't mock belief." And with that, the debate began, not just between two people, but between two worlds colliding on one stage. The Kennedy Lecture Hall transformed from a quiet chamber of academic discourse into an arena of intellectual confrontation. On one side stood Dr. Malcolm Wren, a seasoned scholar of secular ethics, whose voice had shaped think tanks and policy panels across the nation. On the other, Karoline Leavitt, not a theologian or a professor, but a political communicator hardened by years in the White House press room and unshakable in her belief that truth didn't require credentials to be real. The air was tight with tension, students silent but alert, phones raised, capturing every syllable in real time as the clash began in earnest. Dr. Wren was first to strike. "Ms. Leavitt, I respect your passion," he began, eyes narrowing with polite condescension, "but I teach based on peer-reviewed evidence, not Sunday school memory. Tacitus and Josephus, as you referenced, were removed from the events by decades, some say written under duress, political pressure, or based on hearsay. To lean on them as proof is a desperate grasp at straws." Karoline didn't blink. "And yet, you cite Cicero, Plato, and Herodotus in your own research," she replied smoothly. "None of whom lived in the exact time of the events they described. By your own standard, shouldn't we discard most of what we call ancient history?" That landed. Students stirred. A murmur of agreement bubbled at the edges of the room. Wren adjusted his posture. "There's a difference between intellectual tradition and religious dogma." "And that difference becomes blurry," Karoline countered, "when a professor uses the podium to mock belief systems under the guise of objectivity. You didn't just question the divinity of Jesus, you called him a myth, no different than Thor. You didn't invite debate, you shut the door on it." Wren's tone sharpened. "Because we live in a nation where policy is still being shaped by superstition, religion has been weaponized, used to justify war, suppress science, and deny rights. That's not myth, that's measurable damage." "And yet," Karoline said, stepping forward, "the civil rights movement was led by pastors. The abolition of slavery was fueled by Christian convictions. Hospitals, schools, humanitarian missions, all born from the values you just dismissed as fiction. If you want to talk about damage, fine, but don't ignore the healing that came with it." The audience erupted in light applause, not overwhelming but growing. Karoline's voice remained calm, but the weight behind it pressed forward like a tide that wouldn't recede. Wren leaned in, his voice now low and direct. "You believe in miracles, Karoline. That someone walked on water, rose from the dead, turned water into wine. That's not just faith, that's fantasy." Karoline tilted her head, unfazed. "I believe in love, sacrifice, forgiveness, and yes, miracles. You call that fantasy, I call it hope. But here's the thing. I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. I'm asking you to stop pretending history is only real when it agrees with your worldview. That's not reason, that's control." A wave of silence followed. Dense and electric, students didn't shift in their seats anymore. They were locked in. Even Wren seemed to feel it. His hands tightened around the edge of the podium, as if steadying himself. Two voices, two ideologies, one stage, and in that moment, Karoline Leavitt, armed not with a degree in theology, but with clarity and conviction, was no longer defending herself. She was standing for something much larger, and the room was beginning to see it. The moment the tension between Karoline Leavitt and Dr. Malcolm Wren reached its peak, it was as if the Kennedy Lecture Hall itself paused, unsure whether to erupt or recoil. But it didn't stay quiet for long. From the middle row, a hand shot up. A young man in a hoodie, phone still recording, cleared his throat. "Sorry, Miss Leavitt," he said, voice unsure but curious. "You mentioned Tacitus and Josephus. I'm not religious, but if they weren't Christian, why would they talk about Jesus at all? Wouldn't they have ignored him if he was fake?" Karoline turned toward him with a small nod, the first warmth in her expression since the debate began. "That's exactly the point," she said. "They had no reason to support a Christian narrative. In fact, Tacitus wasn't fond of Christians. That makes his mention more credible, not less. When hostile sources acknowledge someone existed, historians pay attention." Before Wren could interject, another voice came from the left aisle. A girl in oversized glasses and a philosophy department hoodie stood up, clutching a notebook. "But don't we have to be cautious about letting belief influence how we define facts?" she asked, directing it at both speakers. "I mean, there's a difference between historical impact and actual existence, right?" Karoline nodded again. "Absolutely. But ignoring a figure's historical presence because of discomfort with their impact isn't scholarship, it's bias. You can separate faith from fact without erasing the person entirely." Wren stepped forward slightly. "It's not about discomfort, it's about discernment. Rational inquiry must question every source, especially those filtered through centuries of theological editing." "But you didn't just question," another student chimed in from the balcony. "You called it fiction, like outright. You didn't leave room for debate until she stepped in." There was a soft rustling of agreement, heads nodding, phones still rolling. In corners of the room, students started whispering, not nervously, but actively, like something had been shaken loose. For once, they weren't watching passively, they were participating. Anya Morales, the event moderator, stood from her seat at the side, sensing the energy had changed. "Let's open the floor," she said, almost as an afterthought. "If students want to weigh in, please." More hands went up. Some challenged Karoline, asking how she balances faith and government service. Others asked Wren if his rejection of all unprovable events excluded ethical systems rooted in spirituality. The back and forth turned alive, no longer a performance between two intellectuals, but a generational reckoning. And through it all, Karoline didn't flinch. She welcomed the questions. She didn't deflect. She listened, clarified, and answered, not with rehearsed rhetoric, but with the quiet resolve of someone who wasn't there to win, but to be honest. And that's when the students really started paying attention, not just to the debate, but to her. For the first time in his long academic career, Dr. Malcolm Wren felt the terrain shift beneath his polished shoes. The questions from students weren't just polite probes. They were pointed, skeptical, and increasingly aware of the contradiction between his earlier certainty and the nuance Karoline Leavitt had introduced. He'd come to the Kennedy Lecture Hall expecting control, applause, and reaffirmation. What he got instead was a room that had stopped nodding and started thinking, and the source of that disruption, Karoline stood just a few feet away, calm, composed, and maddeningly unshaken. He tried to reassert his dominance. "Let's be clear," he said, voice rising slightly. "Tacitus and Josephus are not definitive proof of anything. The passages are brief, possibly tampered with, and decades removed from the actual events. We have no direct eyewitness accounts. Nothing reliable." Karoline, unfazed, responded gently. "We don't have direct eyewitness accounts for most ancient figures. Plato, Socrates, even Julius Caesar in many cases. We rely on fragments, context, and cross-referencing. That's how history works, isn't it, Dr. Wren? You know that better than anyone." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd again, this time less academic, more emotional. It wasn't just about evidence anymore, it was about tone. Wren's sharp dismissal, which once commanded awe, now came across as brittle. And Karoline's composure, once seen as restraint, now radiated strength. He reached for another rebuttal, leaning harder into logic. Even if a man named Jesus existed, so what? Countless figures have inspired myths. That doesn't mean they performed miracles. It doesn't mean they're divine. Karoline nodded. "Agreed, and I never said belief in miracles should be government policy. But denying the existence of someone who shaped moral codes, legal systems, and cultural values across continents? That's not rationalism, that's erasure." Wren pressed his palms to the podium. "Faith is not a substitute for fact. And fear isn't a substitute for truth," Karoline replied quietly. That line hung in the air. No one laughed, no one applauded, they just listened. Wren looked out at the students, many of whom now held phones in their laps, not to text or scroll, but to record. The hashtags were likely already forming. He was trending, but not in the way he intended. Karoline hadn't humiliated him, but she had outmaneuvered him. Not by volume, but by calmness. Not by claims, but by questions. And now, for the first time in years, Malcolm Wren didn't feel like the teacher in the room. He felt like the one being tested. And Karoline? She wasn't done. The debate had tilted, gently at first, then unmistakably, toward Karoline Leavitt. Yet she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't called names, hadn't asked for applause. Instead, she stepped away from the podium and addressed the students directly, her posture relaxed but grounded, as if speaking not to win an argument but to share something real. "I didn't come here to prove miracles," she began, her voice warm but unwavering. "I came here because I heard someone reduce my entire faith, and the faith of billions, to fiction. That's not just wrong, it's disrespectful, and it shuts the door on honest discussion before it even begins." She paused, letting the room breathe with her. You don't have to believe that Jesus walked on water to recognize what he walked through. You don't have to believe in the resurrection to see how his message, love, forgiveness, sacrifice, reshaped the world. Her eyes scanned the room, finding connection in the silence. Faith isn't a fairy tale. It's a lens, one that millions of us use to make sense of suffering, to find purpose, and yes, to lead. From the side of the stage, Dr. Wren stood stiffly, his arms folded, his jaw tight. Karoline turned briefly in his direction. "You may not share my beliefs, Dr. Wren. That's fine. But dismissing Jesus as a myth, without acknowledging the historical and cultural legacy he left behind, isn't scholarship. It's ideology dressed up as intellect." A ripple of applause began, not explosive, but genuine. A girl in the second row leaned forward, nodding slowly. A guy in the back raised his phone higher, recording every word. Karoline finished with a breath. "Faith isn't about forcing others to believe what you do. It's about standing for what you believe, especially when it's mocked." And in that moment, even the quietest skeptics in the room weren't just hearing a rebuttal. They were witnessing a conviction that couldn't be fabricated. It started slowly, like a tide just beginning to shift. A few claps from scattered corners of the Kennedy Lecture Hall. Then a rising hum of agreement, nods exchanged between students who moments earlier had sat silent or uncertain. Now they leaned forward, engaged. Karoline Leavitt had struck a chord, not through spectacle or shaming, but through clarity and authenticity. Her words didn't demand applause, they earned it. One student in the front stood up briefly, clapping with both hands. Another shouted, "She's right!" before sitting back down, embarrassed, but not wrong. A group in the back began filming on their phones, whispering to each other about how the video was already going viral. The momentum had flipped, and Dr. Malcolm Wren knew it. He tried to reclaim the room with one last volley. "Let's not confuse eloquence with evidence," he said tightly. "Truth doesn't change just because someone says it with conviction." But the weight of the room had moved, and Karoline didn't need to say much. She just looked at him and replied calmly, "And arrogance doesn't become truth just because it's spoken from a podium." The audience roared, not mockingly, but with the energy of a generation realizing they weren't just witnessing a debate, they were participating in a cultural moment. Even students who didn't fully agree with Karoline could see she wasn't just defending faith, she was defending the right to believe, without being mocked into silence. Dr. Wren, once the unquestioned voice of authority, now looked smaller, not defeated but undeniably diminished. He'd expected a stage. He hadn't expected a reckoning. And the crowd? They had chosen whom they'd listen to. Long after the students had filtered out and the lights of the Kennedy Lecture Hall dimmed, Dr. Malcolm Wren sat alone in his office, the door closed against the echo of clapping still lingering in his mind. He'd spent a lifetime standing behind podiums, commanding rooms with sharp logic and cutting rhetoric. But tonight felt different. Karoline Leavitt hadn't dismantled his argument with louder facts or flashy performance. She had simply stood her ground, with history, composure, and a kind of faith that didn't ask for agreement, only recognition. And that shook him more than he was willing to admit. He glanced at the corner of his desk where an old, dusty volume of Roman historians sat untouched for years. Slowly he opened it, flipping to the sections on Tacitus and Josephus. He'd cited them once, decades ago, in a paper he barely remembered. Back then, he'd considered all perspectives before he narrowed his lens. But somewhere along the way, certainty replaced curiosity. Her words came back to him. You don't have to believe in miracles, but don't pretend he didn't leave a mark. He closed the book halfway, then reopened it. Not to find flaws, but to remember what drew him to study history in the first place. Truth, not triumph. Her conviction had triggered something old, maybe even buried, the thrill of honest inquiry, unclouded by ego. Wren exhaled, tapping his pen gently against the page. He wasn't ready to change his world view, but for the first time in years he wanted to read, not to refute, but to understand. Not to win, but to question honestly again. Karoline hadn't humiliated him. She'd reminded him of who he used to be. Outside the Kennedy Lecture Hall, the air buzzed with energy as students gathered in clusters, still dissecting what they had just witnessed. Karoline Leavitt stood near the front steps, surrounded by a small group of young attendees eager to ask questions, not about politics, but about faith, history, and how she stayed so composed under pressure. I've had practice, she said with a small laugh, but mostly, I just refused to be talked down to. Her words were already spreading. On TikTok, clips titled, "White House Press Secretary Destroys Anti-Christian Professor" gained thousands of views in under an hour. Hashtags like Karoline at Eastbridge and Faith Wren began trending across platforms. One student approached nervously and asked, "Do you think what you said will actually change anyone's mind?" Karoline paused, then smiled. "Maybe not overnight, but it's not about changing minds. It's about reminding people they're allowed to speak up, that faith and facts aren't enemies." Another nodded and added, "You made it okay to ask questions again." Faculty members lingered in the doorway, watching the conversation unfold. Some looked impressed, others puzzled, but none were disengaged. Karoline had done something rare. She made them think, feel, and respond all at once. Inside, Dr. Wren remained in his office, rereading old texts and replaying the evening in his mind. Outside, Karoline walked slowly across the courtyard, her phone buzzing with messages from staff, journalists, and friends. But she didn't check them, not yet. She paused under the warm glow of a campus lamp, listening to the voices behind her. Tonight hadn't been about going viral. It had been about standing firm for truth, for belief, and for the next generation watching. And they were watching, closely, and now they were questioning too. The story of Karoline Leavitt and Dr. Malcolm Wren offers a powerful lesson about courage, humility, and the value of open dialogue. In an age where faith is often dismissed and reason is weaponized, Karoline didn't show up to convert or condemn. She showed up to challenge the arrogance of certainty. Her calm, fact-based defense of Christianity wasn't a sermon, but a reminder. You can be grounded in faith and still be intellectually rigorous. She didn't win by shouting louder, she won by standing taller, and in doing so she reignited something far more important than applause. She reminded a generation that questioning isn't rebellion, and conviction. For Dr. Wren, the lesson was quieter but just as profound. His moment of reflection showed that even the most confident scholars must sometimes re-examine what they've chosen to stop questioning. It's easy to dominate a room with cleverness. It's harder to listen when the room stops laughing. In a divided world, the story reminds us, truth doesn't fear challenge, and real strength lies in the willingness to stand alone if necessary, so long as you stand for something real. Whether in faith or reason, the search for truth must leave room for both.